right. Well, welcome one more time to our online Bible study. And this one that we've been working on for the past several weeks has been on the book of Ruth. Our graphics have kind of shown us calling it Redeeming Love. And today we really get into the nature of that. A lot of times, if you look at a series and you want to call it something and you can kind of start off at the beginning and end up in the right place. With Ruth, it's kind of hard to do that. Ruth, the book begins with such despair, with death, with droughts and famine and difficulty and a great degree of death. And there's really some things added in there that we don't altogether mention. So I want to throw one out there. It's kind of the things that are unsaid in Ruth. Number one, Ruth, again, that last week was the last thing she said. And so today all works out without her saying a whole lot, and that's interesting. We don't hear the word of the Lord says that phrase in Ruth like we did in Jonah. In Jonah, the word of the Lord kept coming to Jonah, and we don't get that in Ruth. We don't see God's outward work. What we see is God's behind the scenes work. And what we see is God's will being played out by people who are just being faithful. Had they chosen not to be faithful, the book of Ruth would not exist. Had it played out not to be faithful, there are a whole lot of implications that we'll see in today's lesson that wouldn't have happened. And so one of the lessons from Ruth, I think, is just be faithful in what God wants you to do. Follow his rules and regulations, and the things that he wants to happen will happen. And so that plays out too. One of the things I think that comes into play today, and we'll read a kind of a tricky situation here at the beginning, is the Bible tells us that they had been for a while, I think in chapter 1, that they had been in that land for about 10 years. There's an idea, and it's not spoken necessarily, but where Ruth and her sister-in-law had been married for quite some time before their husbands died, and they had not had children, which, in that time, you got married, you had kids, and barrenness was a negative thing. And we read a lot of stories, Elizabeth and others, Hannah, I think, played out from being barren. And what we see from Ruth is that at this point, she's not had a child. And so that's a consideration too. There's a lot of things going on when we start to look at the lesson for today. But what we see is, in last chapter, chapter 3, Naomi says, shouldn't I go and try to find you rest? In other words, shouldn't I go find a situation that resolves our issues? And today is the beginning of that rest, chapter 4. And so I want us to start reading in chapter 4, verse 1, and we'll just go through it kind of verse by verse and talk a little bit here and there as we do. And Boaz had gone up to the gate. Now this is upon Naomi's prediction that Boaz wouldn't take long to settle the issue that we talked about last week, which was, would he or someone else redeem Ruth? And the idea is that there's somebody else in line, a goel in Hebrew, a redeemer. Ruth calls Boaz a redeemer, but he's not the closest. And the closest would have been somebody who could redeem somebody's land, for instance, was part of it. If you died for your land to be carried on in your name, somebody would come along and have a child with the wife, and that firstborn son would inherit the land. And that would not then become your property. That would go back to the other family's property. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And there's an idea that usually was a brother or brother-in-law. Boaz isn't either. And so some people wonder whether he had the responsibility to be the redeemer in this place. But there's somebody else in line, so he wants to give them an opportunity. Now this shows what I think a lot of the people during that time were thinking and how he handled that. So he goes up to the gate, sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. And he says, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. The word friend there is a placeholder. The word friend there in Hebrew, if you look at the words involved, and I know this not because I know a whole lot of Hebrew, but because I read commentaries of people who've studied Hebrew, The words there literally mean such and such. Now, how would you put turn down such and such, turn aside such and such, sit here? But the idea was that such and such was a placeholder of anonymity. Friend is the same thing in English. Hey friend, if you don't want to mention their name out loud, you might call them friend. Hey bud, hey, and you might list all kinds of things. And hey man, how are you doing? If you don't know somebody's name. And so this is not necessarily that they don't know the person's name. It's a specific entity. But in this passage, his name is not given. Now, in the Old Testament particularly, but in the New Testament, the Bible in general, somebody's name was extraordinarily important. All the names had meanings, and we've seen that through Naomi and Bitter and Ruth and all of that, okay? This guy doesn't even get a name, and that tells you a little bit of something about him. So let's keep reading, but that's an interesting, when the Hebrews would have read this and turn aside, Mr. Anonymous, they would have thought, what did he do? Or what's he getting ready to do in this story? So he turned aside and sat down, and he took 10 men, Boaz, of the elders, men of the elders of the city, and said, sit down here. And they sat down. Now the gates of the city were typically a place of business. And typically if a court needed to be held and the elders would act as judges, then they would do that. Here they're primarily acting as witnesses, but they would sit at the gate. Why the gate? Because people would walk by the gate. If you want to run into somebody, that's where you'd run into them. And people would gather there and eat. Today's place where people in town would go drink a cup of coffee or something. And he said to the Redeemer, again, no name, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. More than likely, he would have been aware of that situation because this person could have been a brother, could have been a brother-in-law, with somebody closer in line for the redemption to occur. And so more than likely, he knows the situation. He probably knows about the land. And more than likely, as a potential redeemer, as a potential kinsman redeemer, he knows the law and he knows that there might be something involved there with Ruth. This person in this story has really shown no interest, has done nothing about it, and is kind of waiting to see how it plays out. Because honestly, if Ruth shows herself not to be a person of honor, then maybe she's disconnected and they're able to redeem the land and her not be part of that story. Verse 4, though, I thought I would tell you of it and say, and this is what he says to him, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. So Boaz is saying, you're up. If you redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know, for there's no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. So everybody would have known that Boaz was not the closest, that this other guy was. He's giving him the chance. And the guy says, I will redeem it. Now, if you know the end of the story, this is a little bit of a hook. What's going on here? And it's almost as if Boaz kind of set him up a little bit because he just talks about the land. Now, what happens with the land? You buy the land, presumably at some kind of a discount, and then your family inherits and takes over that land for perpetuity, where you own it forever. Because there's no relatives involved. The fact that Ruth is involved changes that, and I'll explain that in a minute. But in verse 5, Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite. And so he's saying this is a kinsman redeemer situation. When it wasn't, when it was just the property, okay, yeah, I want it. Now that he says, okay, so Ruth the Moabite is involved, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. So you would be buying the land not for yourself and for your own family. You would be buying it, having a child with Ruth, and that child would inherit it for perpetuity for the sake of the other family, not your family. It changes the business aspects of the deal so that the business is no longer I'm buying land for me and I'm going to have it in perpetuity to I'm buying land, I'm keeping it for a generation, I have responsibility to make it worthwhile. And then at the end of that, when this other kid grows up to be old enough, then he gets it and it's not in my family anymore. So why would I buy something that I'm going to keep for 18 years and get rid of? It's more of a lease. And so would you pay purchase price for a lease? And it becomes then not the situation. But that's the aspect of the kinsman redeemer, that you're buying something for someone else, not for yourself. The idea of Jesus is he died for us, not himself. He's the kinsman redeemer. And so he has an opportunity to do this, but it's not a situation that they're requiring him to do. If he gives up that right, somebody else can take it on. And what we see by Boaz saying, if you don't, I will, that Boaz is doing it of free will and not because of any legal aspect, but he's doing something selfless of free will, okay? And so that's where it plays into what Jesus becomes for us, and in the fact that he is our Redeemer, that he has redeemed us. So the Redeemer said, again, he's nameless, I cannot redeem it for myself. The first he said, yeah, I want it. Now he says, oh, no, I can't do it myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. So he's selfish. That's the whole idea. He's not willing to do anything else for anybody else, only himself. So he says, you, Boaz, take my right for yourself, for I cannot. What he means by that is he will not. And I think we understand that to be the case. And so the whole idea is you have one man who's willing, who's not really required by law. The person who's next in line, who it would fall on to do that, says, oh, no, I can't do it. Glad you're willing, because I'm not going to do it. And so we see that aspect play out in life. We can either, by our own choice, step up and help people, which is in redemption of a bad situation, make it right for them, even if it costs us a little. Or we can say, no, I'm not willing to do anything, that would cost me anything, because it might threaten what I already have. The Bible, by the way, is seeking to teach us a point, that his way is generous and giving, even by the fact that Boaz's mom was Rahab, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of our time here today. So then Boaz becomes the Redeemer. Boaz gets the opportunity to do what's right and become really the picture of Jesus in this story. So we get a little bit here in chapter 4, verse 7 of an editorial. So what happens is, in those biblical times, the life of Ruth happened. People tell the story of Boaz and all of that. And then later they would write it down. It would be part of oral history. That is, those family stories that we tell but were never written down. And then after you tell them for a while and you realize, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should write this down. Somebody comes along and writes a family history. That would have been this. So the person writing this down, chapter 7, is writing an editorial letting you know that it's later that somebody's writing it down. But this is what they said. It was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. Now, if it's the custom in former times, and that's what they're getting ready to do, he's telling people that he's writing it for years later, that that's what's happened. And he's going to include a genealogy that includes generations of people after Ruth and after Boaz. And so it's likely that the book of Ruth was maybe written several generations after that. And that's just the way things happened during that time. Oral history tradition was a big thing. It is today, and we just don't always realize it. So anyway, to confirm a transaction, one drew off his sandal, gave it to the other, and it was a manner of attesting it in Israel. So you would walk the land you were going to buy, take off one of the sandals that had walked the land, and the other person had that, and that was proof. Hey, I have his sandal. Of course, that deal went through. Today, we have attorneys and legal writings, but during this time, you can imagine not a whole lot of things were written down. It took years for the story to be written down, much less, say, a deed. Deeds weren't things. You had 10 witnesses, and you exchanged sandals, and that's the way it was. So that's what they did. When the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. It's not real clear which of them took off his sandal, he, Boaz, or he, the Redeemer. But Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. So what he's saying is, I have redeemed all of this property, and I'm going to make right to make sure that the inheritor of that, the firstborn son, would then regain legal rights to that property, so that their land could continue in their family name in perpetuity. In verse 10, also Ruth the Moabite, the woman of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife. The word bought in ESV, which is what I use, is a little harsh. Acquired. And again, we have kind of sensibilities today about our prearranged marriages and all of those things. And we just have to understand it was a different time. Prearranged marriages were there. Ruth obviously was not against it. She was in favor of it. He was in favor of it. And so what he's saying is, I'm stepping up to do what's right, to perpetuate the name of the dead and his inheritance. By the way, remember, we were dead and Christ serves as and I talked about that last time, the kinsman redeemer. that the debt of the name may not be cut off from among the brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses to this day. So there's the transaction. And then we have a couple of really interesting blessings. Now, what we see in chapter 11 is where the elders respond. And it says, then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. Between the two, remember, they had 12 sons for the 12 tribes. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah because of his offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So they're offering a blessing. They're connecting it back to the tribe of Judah. Through Tamar and Judah, in the tribe of Judah through Perez. So then Boaz took Ruth. In verse 13, she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. May his name be renowned in Israel. Why? Because the Redeemer didn't have to redeem. It was a voluntary thing. To find somebody who would give up of themselves turned out not to be as common, which is really kind of sad. You have a chance to do something for somebody in your own family and you won't. And it's kind of difficult to understand. God created us in his image. When we sinned, he did everything within his power to redeem us from that. And we'll see where that meant a lot to him, the idea of a redeemer. And so it's sad that so few of his people chose to be a redeemer, and such that it turned out to be a very interesting book because somebody did do it. Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. May his name be renowned in Israel. This is so interesting, this verse. This verse kind of ties a lot of things together. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Now it switches a little bit. It says you have a redeemer. And at first the redeemer is really talking about Boaz. At the end of that, what we see is the Redeemer that they're talking about in this blessing says, you have has given birth to him. And so Naomi's Redeemer is in many ways her grandson. Because her grandson is the way that land and everything becomes back in the family. It's not Ruth, and it's the first son, whose name is Obed. And Obed means servant in that way. And so Naomi is blessed because of Ruth's actions, which in some ways, for those in her city, they say, is more to you than 7 sons. And not much more in that time important than having children and sons who could carry on your name. We talk a lot about Israel, but we talk about the 12 tribes of Israel, 12 sons of Israel carrying on their name in the 12 tribes and all of that. And so it was a very meaningful thing there to have a son, to have somebody carry on your name. And here's the person who's going to help do that is Boaz, and Boaz is being used. But there's also some emphasis now on the fact that it's the grandson who's really going to be the one who's there to see all of that happen. So verse 16 says, Naomi took the child, laid him on her lap, and became his nurse, a kind of a nanny situation in today's time, where she would take care of him quite a bit. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name. And a son has been born to Naomi, they said, and they named him Obed. And his father was Jesse. He was the father of Jesse and the father of David. So Obed is a name that was given by the community back. So the community was there when Naomi showed up empty-handed after leaving with a husband and 2 sons. They're all dead before they were able to have grandchildren. And so she has nothing in terms of the tribal nature of that day. And the community was there to weep with her. And then when this works out, that she's able to have a kinsman redeemer, the community is there to say, hey, we're now celebrating with you. And they bless her in that way. And then they take part in naming of the son after something beautiful. So they took Naomi and bid her right? Where she said, "Don't call me Naomi, call me better Mara." And then to now, her grandson is going to be the grandson or great grandfather of David, King David. And so let's follow it through, because it tells us a little bit, and it gives us a passage here that I think is interesting. So they give us a little bit of a clue here that he's going to be the line of, the father of Jesse and the father of David, which is part of the blessing of that. The person who wrote Ruth goes ahead and fills in the blank. Now, if they'd written it in that time, they wouldn't have necessarily known all of the different generations. But they give us a genealogy all the way to King David. King David was one of the most influential people of the New Old Testament, and the reason that he was so influential is because it's the Jesus was forecast to be a lion of the tribe of Judah, which he was, but also a sprout off of the tree of David in that way. And so verse 18 says, "Now these are the generations of Perez," who was the son of Judah, by the way. So Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron Ram, Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. So David's father was Jesse, David's grandfather was Obed, right? And David's great-grandfather was Boaz, and great-grandmother was Ruth, a Moabite woman, a foreigner in that way, which is very interesting. So if we stop and we say, it's one thing for the book of Ruth to be in the Bible. It's another for the book of Ruth to play such an instrumental role in the line of King David and the line of who Jesus would be. It's worth stopping and noting. So what I want us to do for a second is take a look at the book of Matthew chapter 1, where we see the genealogy of Jesus. And it's almost like the last few verses of Ruth are repeated. But in Matthew chapter 1, and I'm just going to read verses 3 through 6, we see not just the men mentioned, but we see the women mentioned. And I want us to notice, the Bible includes this because it wants us to know what's important to God and how Jesus came to be. Verse 3, Judah the father of Perez, Zerah by Tamar. Tamar's one woman. Okay? You can read that story on your own. It's interesting, but it's a story, kind of a redemption of a difficult circumstance. Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab. So Rahab's another one. Remember Rahab from the book of Joshua, the 12 spies go in and they trying to take the land, and they eventually find, oh no, we don't know if we can take it, and yet they go back in. Okay, they're going ahead and they're moving in on one of the great cities there. And they have received help because they've had to hide from authorities who found out they're in the city, and she hides them. And then they say, okay, we're going to come back and destroy the city. And she says, save me. And they have her put out the scarlet rope. So Rahab is not an insider, and yet she's included in the genealogy of Jesus by way of her profession before she was converted and became part of Judaism. The Israelites, she was a harlot or a prostitute. But again, a story of redemption. Story of God doing right by his people and those who helped and those who were faithful. So then we have Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, a story of redemption, an outsider, a Moabite. Obed, the father of Jesse, Jesse, the father of David, the king, and David, the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, who would be Bathsheba. Again, a difficult situation. A situation in which some people were unfaithful in various ways. And yet God redeemed that. The story of the genealogy of Jesus is not physical. This one begat that one, begat that one, begat that one, to use the biblical language, or so-and-so the father of so-and-so the father of so-and-so, depending on what version you read. But if you read through those, it's story of redemption followed by story of redemption, followed by story of redemption, followed by story of redemption, followed by big stories of redemption where God included people who didn't deserve to be in that place. or you would not consider them to have deserved, but God obviously did for a reason, because it showcases his redemptive nature. And so what do we see? We see the book of Ruth being a story of redeeming love. How does that fit into the genealogy of Jesus, if not because Jesus' story is a story of redeeming love? It's a story of redeeming love. And what I think that means for us in how we see this passage of Scripture and how we apply it for our own lives is, number one, the days can be dark, but God is not done. God seeks to give us rest, even though we might not have it in the moment. The first chapter is not a chapter of rest in the biblical way. And the last chapter was, where things were settled. We're not at the end of the story yet. We're in the middle. Persevere. Persevere in faithfulness and in honor, and people depend on you in hard work, and all the stories that speak to Ruth's quality of character and Boaz's quality of character. So we need to be human beings, Christians of intense character, godly character. And if we do that, and if we're working in the same direction as God in a redeeming nature, God can take that and do a lot of things with it. Even if we never see God doing it, even if we never hear the word of the Lord said, if we don't hear that audible voice, God worked behind the scenes and did all of these things to align this story with his story. In Ruth, their story was aligned with God's story. In our lives, God wants our story to align with his story of great redeeming love. And it doesn't matter if you've had difficult times. It doesn't matter what position you're in. You're an outsider. You're this, you're that. You're a sinner. You're somebody who's been unfaithful, which the symbol of Bathsheba was infidelity. It doesn't matter all of that. God conquers all of that on his way to redeeming love. In that way, I think you could argue what I said a little while ago, a couple of weeks ago. The story of Ruth is really the good news of Ruth. It's really the gospel of Ruth. Because through it, the story of Jesus can be preached. It's not a story in and of itself. Our story is not a story in and of ourselves. But can God preach his redeeming love through our story? So then what's the gospel of our story? The good news of Jesus is that our story can be redeemed. Our story. So let's talk about rest. Let's talk about, not being selfish. If I could just pause for a minute and let that sink in. Us being willing to do something big for somebody else's sake, even though maybe we don't benefit from that. Us in the search for rest. What does God do with that? And then if we look at the story in Matthew, right? God was building then something that would take place generations later. What if God's doing that in our life? What if our faithfulness is building a generation of children and grandchildren's faithfulness? So it's important. It's important. I hope that you've enjoyed this. Next week we'll take off in a new direction. Until then, I hope that you're doing well. I hope you've enjoyed our study on the book of Ruth, and God bless you.